Hello friends, and welcome back to another video, and a special big hello if you are new. Today I wanted to share with you my top books of 2024 finally. I read 72 books in the year of 2024, and it was so hard to narrow it down to just 10. So the idea of taking these 10 books and potentially sorting them by ranking them in the order that I like them best or the order that they impacted me the most literally feels impossible. So I'm just going to be going in the order that I read them in. I've got my list here in case I forget or lose my pacing along the way. So we'll go ahead and get into it. First, I have The Winners by Fredrik Backman. This is the third book in the Beartown trilogy. Beartown basically is a town that is set, I think it's in Sweden. In Sweden. So the first book takes place where basically it's a very small town, and if you grew up in a small town, then you understand this concept. All of the town's hopes and dreams are stored within their young men's hockey league. And it really seems like that this hockey team could win it all, and this would bring so much glory to this town. They have a very strong rivalry with the town next door, and basically the kids are all out celebrating one night when the star of the hockey team sexually assaults the coach's daughter, and this basically just erupts so much conflict within the town. It causes such division. And if you've read anything by Fredrik Backman that isn't within the Beartown trilogy, then you kind of know him for whimsical and humorous, but also very deep and human works. But this is so much darker than his other works. So that's what Beartown's about. The second book is essentially the aftermath of what happened that fateful night and how everyone's healing from it a year later. And then this takes place quite a few years later. So all of our young characters are young adults now, and how it has impacted the town. It was really great to get to visit these characters that I have grown to love for the past few years. They are embedded in my heart and soul. I do not think any book that I've ever read in my entire life has made me cry like this book has. I downright sobbed for probably hours. I could not calm down. I just laid on the floor and cried after I finished this book. And Clementine kept bringing me toys and dumping them on my lap, here mom, let's try this one. Maybe this will make you feel better. But it was just so good. It's not 100% necessary to the plot, but it was really nice to kind of close everything off and say goodbye to these characters. And there's it's sort of written as an epilogue at the end, so you really find out what happens to everyone many, many years down the road. This is just such a beautiful piece of fiction, and I think this entire trilogy is so important, and I think that literally everyone should read it because it is so impactful. And I love Fredrik Backman. He's one of my favorite writers, but I don't know that he will ever write anything that will compare like this trilogy has. And it was the saddest, but in many ways perfect ending to it. The next book that I have is an audiobook that I listened to, and it is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This tells the story of Chanel Miller's, it's a memoir, and it tells of her sexual assault case. So it gives a little bit into her childhood, the events of the night, and the aftermath, and how that aftermath exploded over years and years. This book came out a few years ago, and I remember how powerful it was in the response that it had when it came out. And it was just one that I just never got around to purchasing or buying. And I wish that I had read it years ago because it is so important. But I'm also really glad that I did wait until I could listen to it on audiobook, because there's something extra powerful in hearing Chanel tell the story within her own words. And again, I think that this is a book that everyone needs to listen to. It brings so much awareness to how horribly women are treated when they speak out against these things. And this wasn't like a her versus him, you know, one word against the other. Like, her assaulter was caught in the act. And I just, you know, may he never have a day of peace in his life. It's just awful. And the events that followed even after the sentencing is just, it's atrocious. And then to see, you know, who we have as president. And it's, this book in many ways, I'm sorry, Clemmy's eating and drinking like right next to me. So if you hear that, I'm really sorry. But I think this book is almost more important now than it was before. It's just, sorry. But I don't know, I've totally lost my train of thought. But again, I think it's just so important, and one that everyone needs to listen to, and the bravery that Chanel has for choosing to come forward and to tell her story on top of everything else that she had already gone through is just, I admire her so much for that. The audiobook also includes, I think, the fiction, or like not the fiction, I'm sorry, the regular book, the print book also has her victim statement in it, which I had listened to quite a few years ago. And it's, again, just very, very powerful and very, very important. In a change of heaviness, the next book that I have for you is A Funny Story by Emily Henry. I adore Emily Henry so stinking much, and I feel like there's a disservice to her when she's marketed purely as romance, because I think that her books have so much depth to them, and there's so much more to them rather than just being a love story. Her characters are so well done and human and relatable in what they're going through, and it isn't just like a cutesy love story. It is a cutesy love story, but there's so much more to it. So Funny Story tells the story of a young woman named Daphne. She is engaged to a man named Peter, and then he pretty much comes out to her and says that he is in love with his childhood best friend. So now Daphne has to begin this new life, and she is moving in with her ex's current girlfriend's ex, Miles. And basically what happens is they find out that Miles and Daphne find out that their exes are getting married. They call them and tell them, and they kind of retaliate by saying, oh, well, that's fine. Like, we'll be each other's date to your wedding because we're dating and we're like falling in love. And so you have that element of fake dating, but it is just so, I don't know. It's just, I love it so much. And the way that the characters help each other find themselves and come into their own, especially after being in relationships with partners that were kind of stunting their growth, is really beautiful. Beach Read is my favorite Emily Henry, and after I read Funny Story, I was like, I need to go reread Beach Read to make sure it's still my favorite, and it still is by far, but this really came a very close second for me. I've seen a lot of comparisons of people saying that Miles reminds them of Nick from New Girl, and I personally do not see that. I don't know where that came from. Miles does kind of seem to be directionless in life, but I think that he definitely has a lot of direction. It's just not in as conventional of a way, or he's, perceived as a little bit of a slacker, when in reality he's truly not, but he just doesn't really give a hoot what other people think. And he kind of helps Daphne find that as well. It's just cute and funny and wonderful, and I loved it, and I can't believe we're getting another new Emily Henry book this year. It just makes me so happy. Keeping on the tone of romance, another book that I read was Reckless by Elsie Silver. I loved the whole Chestnut Springs series by Elsie Silver. I devoured them, and when I was debating on putting this on my list, I just had to really think that I read the entire Chestnut Springs series. I read as many books as I could in the Rose Hill series that are out now, and I started Gold Rush Ranch, I think, is her first series. So I've already started books in it. I just wanted to read everything that she had ever written. And they are romance books. And they're cowboy romance books, which I find really funny because I grew up in a very small town and on a farm. And I really wanted nothing to do with that kind of side of life in my teens and like early 20s. And so I find it very funny that like the niche romance genre that I'm falling into is like cowboy romances. But one thing I really love about Elsie's stories is a lot of times with romance books, you have that third act breakup. And that's something that I despise. I hate it. It irritates me so much. And while I fully understand that we can't get together, you know, halfway through the book and then live happily ever after. That's not practical, and it doesn't create a very good story. The conflicts that Elsie's characters face, they handle it like adults, and they talk it through and they work through it in a really healthy way. And maybe we don't start off working through it in a healthy way, but we get there eventually. Out of all the Elsie Silver books that I read last year, Reckless was my favorite. It tells the story of Theo and Winter. They're kind of complete opposites, and they have a wild night together, and they end up, Winter ends up pregnant, and she reaches out to Theo, and there's complete darkness. His assistant or someone in his team did not let him know what Winter had said. So years down the road, I think the baby's like 1 or 2, he finds out that he is a dad, and they work together to co-parent, but they also, work together to fall in love. And it's really sweet, especially how Theo encourages Winter, because she's kind of a very harsh, very closed off person. Like, her name is very symbolic to how people perceive her, and how he encourages her and brings a lot of warmth and sunshine into her life. It's just a really, really, really beautiful little story, and I really recommend it. If you need a good escape from reality and you just want something cute and romantic, just go read some Elsie Silver. Another new author to me, and kind of sticking with the romance genre, was Ashtyn Newbold. I read, I think they're called the Noble Charades series. These are not romantasy, my brain. They're Regency rom-coms, and they are just hilarious. I love the way she writes. She makes me laugh out loud so much, not just like a little smile. I also really love, kind of in contrast with Elsie Silver's books, Ashtyn's are closed-door romances, and I don't really lean either way with my books, but if I'm going to read a Regency romance, I do prefer a closed-door element, just because I think it's more fitting with the times. I'm reading a Regency romance because I love Jane Austen, and I want that longing and yearning. I don't want you sneaking off into a corridor 100 pages in. Like, I want you to touch hands by accident and think about it for the next 10 pages. That's what I want, and this definitely delivers on it. My favorite book in the Noble Charade series is The Earl Next Door, which is like an enemies to lover kind of dynamic. It tells the story of our heroine. I think her name's Henrietta, and she has to flee London because she caused a little mistaken, very humorous scandal. So she is going to Bath with her sister, and the point of going to Bath with her sister is because they thought her sister's childhood love was going to be renting next door. And it's very important to Henrietta that her sister and her childhood love, Miles, have a opportunity to reconnect, because she feels that she prevented them being together. When instead Charles, our hero, moves in next door, he is in Bath to court a particular woman because he wants to marry a woman with a fortune to prevent his younger sister from making a very poor match with a man who is so much older than her and just basically just an icky man that she should not be with. So Henrietta automatically hates him because of this, because he's in the spot where Miles should be, and they really come at each other and like try to publicly embarrass each other in these really subtle ways, and it is so stinking funny. But anyway, they come together after like a confession to hurry up and let Charles or Charlie make a match. That way he can get out of Bath and Miles can move in. But of course, you know what happens. They end up falling in love, and it is so sweet because, like I said, you have that enemies to lovers kind of element. But also it's like, can we make this work? Because this isn't the plan and I don't have a fortune. So it's just really sweet, and I really adored the way that she wrote her books. So good. Kind of continuing on with romance. I think this is the last like romance book that I really have to mention. It is, I think it's called Drinker of Ink. I was making sure it wasn't the or a. Drinker of Ink by Shannon Castleton. This is a debut book by her. It tells the story of a young girl in the 90s. She is going to college in California and her family is in New York. I think pointing out that it's in the 90s is really important because she's really homesick and she can't just text or FaceTime her family. Her mother was really sick when she was younger, and she's very anxious about the idea of her mother becoming ill again. And kind of on top of all of these things that are going on in her life, she is beginning to fall in love with a graduate student who is teaching one of her poetry classes. He is only a couple years older than her, so it's not like a creepy age dynamic. She's not falling in love with some tenured professor that is way too old for her. And the whole book is told within her journal entries, and it is just the most beautiful and most sweet love story. And I feel like describing it does not do it justice, because I cannot put into words the emotion that this book will evoke and how deep it resonated with me. I don't have a physical copy because it was on Kindle Unlimited, but I long to have a physical copy because there were so many parts that I highlighted and so many sections that stuck out to me. I just want a physical copy that I can tab and highlight and share with people so they can see my thoughts and how wonderful it was. And I do know that I will end up getting a physical copy at some point because I know that this is a book that I will continue to reread throughout my lifetime. I think back to this book all the time. Honestly, probably out of all the books on my list, this is the one that I kind of think back to the most. It may not have been the one that made me feel the most in my heart or evoke tears or anything like that or giddiness, but I think back to it probably on a weekly basis. It was so good. All right, so switching gears a little bit, the next book that I have for you is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I wanted to read this book for years and years and years, and I'm so happy that I finally decided to this summer. I was a big fan of James Dean, hence why this is my edition, growing up, and especially like in middle school. So I had seen the 1955 film version many times like growing up, and I thought I had a pretty good idea of what the story was about, but I don't. The 1955 film covers maybe the last like fourth to third of this book, and there's just so much more in the story that I wasn't aware of, and so many really wonderful characters that are not included in the film, which I think, having watched the film now after reading the book, I would be extremely disappointed in. But it basically is a generational tale. It starts at the beginning of the 20th century and then ends right around the First World War. It basically starts off telling the story of the grandfather, which I think takes place kind of after the it takes place after the Civil War, and kind of goes into a little bit of detail there, and then it goes into his two sons, which are Adam and Charles. Goes into their childhood, their adulthood, and then Adam's two children, which are Caleb and Aaron, or Cal and Aaron. It is a retelling of the biblical story of Cain and Abel, but which really takes place toward the end as we're getting into the First World War. But I also think that Adam and Charles's upbringing and relationship is very similar as well, and there's a lot of parallels to that. And it also ties into some point of views of some other families, especially the Hamiltons, who kind of become Adam's neighbors when he settles in California. Again, I feel like this is one of those books that's very difficult to describe the emotion and thoughts that it will provoke. I didn't tab it this read just because I know it's a book that I will reread in my lifetime, and I tend to get very overwhelmed when I read books for the first time, and the second time I kind of know more of what's actually going to stick out. But it's truly a masterpiece. It is truly one of the greatest stories ever told, and the way it ties in those biblical concepts is very fascinating. The characters are so rounded and well done. Kind of our villain throughout the story, Kathy, is probably the most vile woman character I've ever read about in my life. I just really recommend it, and I hope that the size doesn't scare you, because where it tells the story of so many different generations, it's kind of a story within a story within a story. So it breaks apart really well, and it's not just like 1,000 pages on one character. So hopefully that kind of lessens the intimidation for it. But again, one of these books, it's a classic for a reason. It's been around for generations for a reason. It's one that you definitely should read. Next, I have a book that I'm really surprised made it onto my list, and it is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. It starts off in France in 1714, and it tells the story of a young woman named Adeline. Basically, she sees her life lining up in front of her, and it is to get married and to have children, and maybe, if she's lucky, live to like 40. And that just seems horrible to her, the idea of being a wife and popping out as many children as she can until she dies. So on the eve that she is set to be married, she runs out into the woods to pray to the gods to spare her from this fate. And there's like an adage in the book that says you should never pray to the gods that will answer after dark. But she's desperately praying, and she doesn't realize it's like dusk. So she doesn't realize it's getting dark. And the God that answer gives her immortality and gives her the freedom to go wherever she chooses, to live as many different lives as she can. And the catch is that anyone she ever sees for the rest of her life will instantly forget her. So if she were standing here in this room and I walked out, when I came back into the room, I would have no idea who she is. So this goes on until 300 years later in New York in the 2000s. I'm going to see if I can find like the exact year. It looks like 2014. She meets a young man who can remember her. And I don't know. I feel like that's a good grab to tell you about the story, because if I talk about it too much more, I will spoil it. I devoured this book. I thought about it consistently. I just didn't want to stop reading it. I love the way the timeline span, and I love all of the people that Addie met in her life, and how even though they couldn't remember her, there were still moments where they continually met up because there was just a connection with their souls, even though they couldn't remember her. It was really fascinating to read about different periods in history all within one book, and kind of the love story in modern time it was just amazing. And it was, again, a big surprise because I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I know that literally everybody has read this book. They've read it years ago. And I've always wanted to, I just never did. So if you're one of the people like me who have not read this book, then go ahead and do it, because it is truly, truly such a treat. The next book comes probably as no surprise if you know me in real life, and it is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I love Sally Rooney. She is one of those writers where you either like her work or you don't like her work. I don't think that there is a gray area. I adore her writing, and I always have, and I don't know that I've ever read a Sally Rooney book and it not make it into my top books at the end of the year. Intermezzo tells the story of two brothers, Peter and Ivan, who are mourning the death of their father. Peter is in his 30s. He's very successful. He kind of has everything going for him on the outward appearance, but he is struggling so deeply inwardly with anxiety and depression, but you wouldn't know that by looking at him because he seems so successful. He is torn between two different women in his life. The first is his childhood love, Sylvia. They had to break up due to an injury that she had that really impairs her quality of life. So they have reconnected after his father's funeral, and then he is also dating a college student named Naomi. So his younger brother Ivan is 22, so there's about a whole generation difference between the two of them. He's very socially awkward. He is a competitive chess player, and he is meeting and dating an older woman named Margaret, who's even older than Peter. It is so fascinating to read about the way the two brothers grieve, because they are grieving very similarly but also very differently, and they can't understand each other. I also found the brothers' judgment to one another in terms of their relationships very interesting. Peter is judging Ivan for dating a woman who's much older than him, but yet Peter is in a relationship that's just reversed. He's just dating a girl who's much younger than him. It was just really profound and thoughtful, and I think a little bit different than some of Sally Rooney's other books. While it does explore the complexities of relationships and the nuances and our inability to properly communicate with one another, I think the exploration of grief really brought a very interesting aspect to this one as well. And it was just really good. So if you are curious about this one, I highly recommend you just go ahead and do yourself a favor and read it. You will cry. It will be really hard. There were times that I would be reading it at night and I'd have to put it down because I was like, I can't handle the emotions, but it's a really impactful story that I think will stay with you forever. All right, we have one more book to talk about, and it is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This, ironically, was the last book that I read in 2024. I read it on like the 26th or 27th, and so many people at that point were putting up like their top books of 2024, and I was just reading like one of my favorites. This is set in the 80s in Irish. It leads up to Christmas. Basically, a coal merchant is delivering coal to the local convent, and he makes a very startling discovery. And he is torn between kind of going along with the status quo and just ignoring this horrible event like everybody else in his town is, or doing what he feels is the right and honorable thing. His childhood and his upbringing definitely come into play of why this hits so hard for him. And it also ties in about Magdalene laundries, which is something that I have been trying to learn more about. It is the definition of small but mighty. This book is like 115 pages long, but when you finish it, because it is so impactful and it's so well written, and so the pacing and the story is just so perfect that you feel like you've just read a 500-page book. Like, I could go on about this book for hours, and it's so tiny. It was probably one of the shortest books that I read, and without a doubt, it is the shortest book on my list. But it is just so impactful and thought-provoking, and the hypocrisy within a season of charity, with Christmas coming, versus turning their back on people, the community, and his wife and everyone choosing to turn their back on people in need is very poignant. And I just felt like the creative choices to tell this story were great. And I loved it. Again, I think that, like with a lot of books on my list, I think that this is one of these books that everyone needs to read. It is very kind of disturbing at times to realize what was going on, but it's not told in like a graphic way. It's just kind of showing you this atrocity and pointing it out to you that it happened. This is the only book I've ever read by Claire Keegan, but I know for sure that I am going to try to get my hands on as many of her books as possible now. All right, friends, that sums up the books that, or not all the books, but my favorite books of 2024. Thank you so much for being here and listening to me babble on about books. As always, I'm sorry for all of the extra sound effects that Clementine had. I do apologize for it, but you know, it's just life with a dog, I guess. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.